Okay, thank you very much. I'm going to call us to order. So that we can focus on all of the incredible substantive things of interest, I'm going to introduce our panel very briefly. They have lengthy biographies, as you can imagine, and they're in the program for those of you who are interested. My name is Chris Blattman. I'm a professor at the University of Chicago in the Harris Public Policy School, and I'm an economist and a political scientist. And I, in addition to studying organized crime principally in Latin America, I have a background in studying organized armed groups in sub-Saharan Africa for many years. And I now coordinate an intellectual research network of policymakers and scholars worldwide called the Network for Research on Organized Crime. And we're established a set of crime labs, not just in Chicago and New York, but now we've built crime labs in Mexico City, Rio, Medellin, and we're hoping to build out elsewhere. And so I was really delighted to be asked to moderate this session. We're going to begin with an address from Tuesday Retano, who is the managing director for the Global Initiative Against Transnational Organized Crime. So we could not ask for a better introduction. She's going to join us virtually, and she comes to that role from a very long and productive career in a variety of UN organizations. I'm happy that we're joined in person by several people. Eduardo Vergara, who's here to my left, who was a former vice minister for security in Chile, now heads the Citizen Security Division at the Inter-American Development Bank, the only development bank with a large dedicated citizen security division, very laser focused on organized crime, also unusual for a massive level of commitment, $2.5 billion over the next, how many years? 3 years, 2 left. So line up for your loans. We're also joined by Maria Paz Jervis, who's the executive vice president of the Ecuadorian Chamber of Industries and Production, whose member organizations comprise an enormous share of the Ecuadorian economy outside of oil, and just a long and storied career as a business leader in Ecuador. And as you may know, Ecuador, as we're going to talk about, has suffered a sudden crisis of organized crime and violence that caught many by surprise. And it's sadly not the last country, I think, that is going to realize that in some sense its problem has metastasized, not before it's too late, but once it's already quite well embedded. We're joined virtually by Ismael Momniat, who's the former Director General of Tax and Financial Sector Policy in South Africa, who also comes from a nearly 30-year-long career in the South African government, especially the National Treasury, who will bring a perspective from there. And then finally, we're joined by Dr. Eric Kwa, who's the Secretary for Justice and the Attorney General of Papua New Guinea. So a really amazing set of speakers. I just want to set the scene a little bit for what the stakes are here. I've been working on organized crime in Chicago and in Latin America, particularly, also somewhat in West Africa for about 10 or 15 years. I think of it as the most important problem in the world that receives the least attention from development actors and governments of all stripes. We're here at the Fragility Forum, which is naturally laser focused on conflict and violence. And they've been sort of close friends and partners of mine and researchers like me for decades, since their formation. And I pulled away from, about 10 years ago, from the core topics within, that are normally covered at the Fragility Forum, partly because it dawned on me just how not only large but enduring are the impacts from organized crime. So I want you to think about all of the death and human destruction that comes from warfare, and every single war combined. Multiply that number by 5, and that's the number of homicides every year. because of the, mostly in urban areas, and because of the share of homicides for which organized criminal groups and gangs are responsible, the number of homicides every year globally that are attributable to organized crime and gangs exceeds that from all civil and international wars combined. It does not receive a proportional share of development assistance or attention or research, and in that essential negligence and neglect, it thrives. I come from Chicago. Chicago sometimes, and certainly in the past, has had a very serious organized crime and violence problem. And so we feel it very much every day. We, for the 80s and 90s, we had a set of competing confederations or factions or facciones, much like we would have in Rio or like the Maras in El Salvador. And war in Chicago, which was intense and bloody, shook the city for 20 years. After sustained law enforcement action, we're now at a situation where we still have hundreds of small armed groups still selling drugs, but fragmented and fighting each other on a lower scale with occasional escalations of violence. And the human and direct cost of that is extraordinary. Last year, 3 University of Chicago students were killed. Right, the admissions committee doesn't like me to advertise that fact, but just to bring home just how problematic that is. So obviously that's problematic for the university and jobs at the university. We are here to talk about economic development and jobs. But when Ken Griffin, our city's largest philanthropist, and his organization Citadel, one of the most powerful investment organizations in the country, left Chicago amidst one of these violence crises and moved to Miami, he said his chief reason was the violence. When Boeing moved their headquarters out of Chicago into Virginia, they named amongst their chief reasons the instability and the violence. And when Amazon HQ2 picked one of your, I guess, suburbs for over many contenders, including Chicago, they didn't explicitly say that violence was part of the problem, but we have our suspicions. And so there are very clear development impacts, and so we can even feel them here in our own cities. It's worse in other parts of the world, particularly Latin America. If you interview and survey Latin Americans, 1 in 10 Latin Americans will tell you that they're governed by a gang. They're also governed by the state, most of them, but many of them are also look for security and dispute resolution to a gang, sometimes primarily to a gang. The prison systems are commonly captured, politics becomes corrupted, and this becomes one of the greatest stresses and sources of weakness and government illegitimacy because of the inability to deal with these problems. And I personally think it is very strongly behind the extremist turn in politics, whether that is to the extreme left or the extreme right, to the grasping for populist, authoritarian, human rights violating approaches out of anger and desperation. And yet we know little about how these organizations function, and we know, and the toolbox isn't quite empty, but it's pretty sparse. And so that's kind of where we find ourselves. To continue to set the stage, so what we're going to do is we're going to jump to 2, potentially 3 rounds of questions with our panelists, where everyone's going to try to keep their responses to about 3 minutes. And we're going to, Ezekiel is going to use his red card to keep us in line so that you have an opportunity. We're going to very much try to preserve a substantial amount of time for questions, which is going to mean that not all of us are going to be able to answer every question. The curse of a panel is one question gets answered and all 5 members feel like they have to answer. We're going to try to limit to 1 or 2 people answering each question so that we hear from you. But before we kick off that round of Q&A and panel discussions, we thought, in addition to my stage setting, we'd have Tuesday, who's joining us virtually, set the stage with a brief 8-minute overview, going into a little bit more depth and concreteness some of the issues I've just set up. And so I believe I hand over to Tuesday, and thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Chris, and to ladies and gentlemen, and all of the delegates at the Fragility Forum. I am so incredibly sorry not to be with you in person today. I'm actually in Tokyo, where it is a horrifying 2 o'clock in the morning. So you will please give me points for my commitment, and you will forgive me any slips of the tongue that come out while I'm speaking. And I have to say also, since moderators never get to plug themselves, one of my real regrets not being in the room is I can't get Chris to sign my copy of his book, which is an absolutely excellent analysis of why it is groups and people turn to violence. So, Chris, next time, please. So, as you heard, my name is Tuesday Raytano, and I am the Managing Director of the Global Initiative Against Transnational Organized Crime. For those of you who don't know us, we are an independent civil society think tank. We are probably the largest independent body focused on the study of the global illicit economy, criminal markets, and actors. We have about 160 staff working in 17 regional observatories around the world, and they matrix across a number of global thematic centers of expertise to try and capture a contemporary and evolving picture of the illicit economy, its impacts, and what we really need to do to respond to it. So we are a policy-orientated think tank, and responses are very much part of our business. For us, the topic of this panel is extremely pertinent. I mean, organized crime is first and foremost an economic proposition, and you've already heard a hint of how much harm organized crime does to the legitimate economy. But I think we also need to consider how much it generates in terms of economic activity and what the impacts of some of that illicit money is. But what really matters in the differentiating illicit activity from illicit activity or criminal actors from legitimate actors is that illicit markets are underpinned by violence or the threat of violence. And that is a strategic and important difference that permeates across all kinds of criminal economy analysis. And even now, as we see the world in flux with technology and geopolitics very much reshaping the way that the world operates, they are equally reshaping crime. So it really is a good juncture at which to consider what the new reality of the upper world and the underworld might look like and how we try and ameliorate some of the harms between them. Chris gave you good statistics, so I won't repeat them in the interest of time, about how prevalent criminal violence has become. But what I did want to do was unpack what drives criminal violence in this conversation. What we've seen from our analysis around the world is essentially criminal violence has three objectives, more or less. Firstly, it is violent competition between groups for control of territory. And you heard some of the descriptions about what it means to have criminal governance in place, all of the real epicenters subnationally of violence, often urban as noted, but also often in places of critical borders like Tabatinga in Brazil or other triple border frontiers, where you see homicide rates reaching, say, around 100 out of 100,000, which is equivalent to most war zones. These are places where criminal groups are fighting for control over territory and influence. And that is extremely important for them in terms of furthering their own economic interests. The second form of criminal violence that we see is violent signaling. It's often something which happens as control is consolidated in an area. So there is no longer an outright contestation, but a controlling and dominant criminal group needs to continually demarcate and set the boundaries of the areas that they control. They tend to aim violence, targeted violence, at independent voices, at civil society, at key members of the communities in which they're based, or they target local officials and prominent personalities, because this provides a symbolic sign of the control influence they still have and a coercive power over the others. Then finally, and in some ways this is what I think people think about when they're talking about organized crime most classically, violence is a service, and it's a service that organized crime sells to a set of malign actors, if you like, everything from businessmen wanting to reshape the market they're in through threats or extortion to local politicians who are so hoping to illegitimately secure votes. Of the three factors that I've just mentioned, these first two, which work hand in hand, are so important because of this capacity to develop and deliver criminal governance in a territorial space, to earn a criminal group criminal rent, and to tax the legitimate economy or extort the illicit economy. 2025 data from ACLED shows a really clear shift towards urban and economically embedded violence, where control over markets, transport corridors, or livelihoods is a driver of conflict and violence. We also saw this in research that we published last year, which was a mapping of 350 subnational illicit hubs in West Africa, where we saw how trafficking routes and armed violence and local governance systems overlap and intersect, and in doing so, reinforce and sustain each other. So the violence isn't destroying the market, but it kind of reorganizes itself around a system of coercion and violent control. Another really good and pertinent example is Haiti, where armed groups are increasingly controlling transport corridors, fuel distribution systems, food supply chains, and access to employment and jobs. So daily economic survival for the people who live in Haiti depends on being able to navigate the systems, work with the criminal groups, negotiate access, pay the fees, and rely on informal arrangements with highly armed criminal actors. So there is absolutely no doubt when you look at examples like this and others around the world, and it's not just by any means in fragile states and places. We're seeing these little pockets of emerging criminal governance contestation in places in Europe. Chris gave you a lot of examples of North America. But you can't doubt really that crime is an economic actor in this context. I think what we also have to look at, though, is it is a livelihood generator. And it's become a livelihood generator in places where the legitimate economy isn't providing what it should in terms of jobs and economic opportunities. And so the illicit economy becomes a powerful place to generate employment and future prospects. In some places, this looks like an artisanal mine site, which is criminally controlled, or another form of criminally controlled extractive industry. But it also has new and modern forms. In those contexts, the livelihoods generated by the illicit economies and the criminal governance that the criminal groups provide to the people who are employed and live within the zones of their control can generate some legitimacy and loyalty for those groups. But fundamentally, it is still an association and a respect that comes from vulnerability, from fear, and from lack of alternatives. And I think that's where it becomes important for development actors to consider their role. One of the key findings from our Global Organized Crime Index, which is something we publish biannually for 193 countries around the world, is one of the biggest shifts that we saw in the three editions that we've had through 2021 to 2025 is that organized crime is itself appearing to transition from violence-centered economies to more economic-centered crime. And in some ways, this follows technological change and the opening up of virtual spaces, which may seem to be inherently less violent. The fastest and most pervasive growing forms of crime that we see both in the index, but also through our policy work and engagement with states, are financial and economic crimes. Fraud, cyber-enabled fraud, money laundering, cyber-enabled exploitation, the scam industry, or just criminal infiltration of legitimate markets using virtual space. In these environments, the criminal actors that are perpetrating and expanding their operations are doing so through a very service-orientated and decentralized model. So they build tools which allow small-scale criminal entrepreneurs to spring up, replicate best practices, and be self-run and managed. We've studied things like the scam center phenomena on 4 continents, comparing the really large-scale cyber-enabled scam operations in Southeast Asia, which you see, industrial labor systems based upon forced labor or forcible recruitment of labor, people moved across borders and highly organized into structured exploitative environments for the purposes of financial fraud, through to places like in Ukraine or in the Caucasus or in Latin America, where scam centers have become a profitable local economy, able to provide livelihoods where the formal economy has come under strain. In a similar phenomena, the changing trend in global narcotics has also shifted the way that illicit economies are providing livelihoods. We're kind of moving away from the very localized physical production economies of cocaine and heroin, which have growth source countries through very familiar trafficking routes to typical destination countries in the West, to a very decentralized, fragmented supply chains of the global synthetic markets, where small groups specialize in production, aggregation, and distribution systems through mostly online marketplaces and distribution. They sell on the dark web or through social media, and they distribute their drugs to the consumer through either parcels or dead drops, so that it broke the physical contact between these potent drug markets and the people who consume them. And so while this made drug markets less violent for the consumers, and that we've certainly seen this in a widespread way across Europe, they haven't stopped the fact that for those people working in criminal industries, these remain quintessentially organized crime businesses, where workers are trapped through deception, debt, and governed by violence in the work that they do. I wanted, before closing, to come back to the third form of criminal violence that I mentioned, which was violence as a service, because here we're seeing evolutions too. It feels often, this violence as a service, like the traditional job that organized crime has always done. It's old-fashioned compared to cyber scams or synthetics markets, but it still remains a very potent part of the criminal violence mix, because it's often, for me, the point where organized crime and politics tends to combine. As criminal groups evolve and organize and achieve territorial control, they increasingly have to negotiate space with local authorities. They may need state protection to continue to operate, so they trade their right to operate in their criminal enterprise for acting as a violent arm of a political actor, for which gang activity in Kenya in the recent elections, for example, or looking historically back at Jamaica and the growth of organized crime in Jamaica, are really strong examples based around sort of a criminal political compact where the criminal groups will use violence to co-opt and electorates in favor of their chosen political candidate in a very clientelist relationship. But what you see is the way this can evolve into a increasing co-option and progressive capture of parts of the state. In many places, organized crime is running for office and more regularly securing those electoral positions, using violence to deter legitimate candidates from competition, as the really horrifying levels of violence around elections in Mexico have shown in recent years. We're also now seeing certain malign states actors under a phenomenon that we've termed geocriminality in the GI, using organized crime as a form of statehood, buying violence, targeted killings, acts of arson or destruction of property in order to incite social dissent in other states and communities as a form of statehood, eventually, or foreign policy or political pressure. My little 8 minutes is up, so I just wanted to close with some thoughts before we go to the panel about what does this mean for development actors and what do we need to see development actors do in this space. And I think for me, it's really keep front and center the need for economic solutions to economic problems. Even while it feels like addressing the huge levels of violence and spiraling levels of violence might be the imperative, these problems can't in a sustainable way be solved by fighting fire with fire. We need a different set of solutions if we're going to see a long-term reduction in crime. What our organized crime index demonstrated very clearly is that in some ways we're moving into a resilience crisis, a state's resilience crisis, a widening gap between the adaptability and strength of illicit economies compared to a weakening ability of states and societies to respond. On every single metric in the index, organized crime has increased, while on every metric similarly, resilience has either stagnated or weakened over the 3 iterations. Particularly, we saw weaknesses in prevention activities, in victim support, in engagement with non-state actors, in transparency and accountability. States are investing primarily in law enforcement or securitized responses, while the real social and economic foundations of resilience are eroding. I think we need to see a reinvestment into prevention, into social trust, into local organizations and economic opportunities, which is the factors that fundamentally reduce vulnerability to criminal economies. And we need to learn to look more carefully for economic alternatives for those who have been in criminal businesses that will resonate in the same way criminal economies have. But I think there are wider development responses to the bigger development community, and it's always useful to talk to the people who are development banks in the room and on the panel, is that we also need to look at the economic enablers of crime. Our research has shown that the really permissive environments in the global financial and trade systems have allowed crime to flourish, to move and discreetly hide their profits within commingling within the legitimate economy. And we need to think at haste about how we better govern and regulate things like the spaces fintech, offshoring, or free trade zones have created for criminal enterprises. And finally, I think we really need to build more bulwarks into our democratic governance systems to prevent criminal influence, reviving election monitoring in a meaningful way, both nationally and subnationally, and looking both at instances of violence and of illicit finance, working to reduce the cost of elections, ensuring party political financing legislation and oversight are in place, closing the space for lobbyists, either directly or indirectly, and managing political technology. All of these are key if we're going to provide spaces for a robust societal response to grow. I don't naively think any of the things that I've listed are easily achieved, and particularly not in the geopolitical context we find ourselves now. But there really are good practices and important examples. And on that, I shall turn with pleasure over to the panel, who I'm sure will share and discuss some of their experiences. So thank you very much, all of you, for letting me join you this evening.
Great. Thank you, Tuesday. Marie, if we could start with you. My impression from afar is that Ecuador thought that this kind of deterioration in security was a problem of its neighbors, Colombia and Brazil, and then this deterioration in security has been rapid and severe and frightening. You sit in industry, what, maybe just try to make it concrete for us. What has this actually done for the day-to-day decision-making, for the investment, for the hiring of firms and the industries you work with in the country?
Thank you so much. I'm glad to be here. Definitely what is happening in Ecuador for the last couple of years is crazy. And I believe nobody is ready to face all these criminal organizations and this new way the societies have been organized. But definitely what happened in Ecuador, and if you let me, I would like to go a little bit behind, because it's, for us as Ecuadorians, it's really hard to understand, and I'm sure for you also. What we have, this security situation, it's been very rapidly and very severe. And traditionally, Ecuador was considered more like a path, transit from Colombia and Peru, transit cocaine, basically. But in these last years, all these criminal groups and organizations have made much more intensive the country's infrastructure. I mean, they use roads, they use ports, logistic, like these corridors, and they move cocaine, but also they begin having a strong presence in our country, which means that all the layers of the society are involved in one way or another. And this, that I'm saying, is pretty shocking, but this is how we feel it. For instance, the scale of this is enormous. I'm going to go a couple numbers and data to understand. In 2022, around 22 organizations and criminal groups were identified. Today, the reports from armed conflict location and event data indicates the existence of at least 48 groups from the ones that we have record. We don't know if there's any more. Ecuador has also become one of the countries with these highest levels of violence deaths in the world. In 2025, the country have around 9,200 violent deaths, compared with approximately 1,300 in 2020, which means violent deaths increased more than sixfold in only 5 years. From the productive perspective, we have these local groups have sponsored by or connected to international structures, which means that is something that we can not only fight inside our borders. They operate like illegal enterprise. They recruit workers, they charge for protection, control territory, impose rules and sanctions, and capture rents. How you make business in this environment? Well, there's a couple things. First of all, we have to understand that this criminal violence operation totally changes the cost structures, because organized groups, they need resources to expand all their operation. And we have to admit that they are very organized and very good doing this, something that not necessarily when you're in the legal side, we are so, how to say it in English, dynamic to do this, okay? So we have to face the reality that firms operating have basically three options. Going back to the legal business that I represent, we have three options basically to keep operating in this scenario. First of all, you have to really hire more private security. which of course this increases the costs a lot because we have the insurance, all the systems of surveillance, communication equipment, specialized protection, etc., etc. The second, the second option or that you're facing with a legal business is that you have to pay extortion in order to keep operating. And this that I'm saying out loud, I know that it sounds pretty shocking because before, when I was in the academia as a school teacher, I was maybe, for me, it was harder to understand because if you go from a moral principle, if this organization crime approached me and said, you have to pay, I won't pay. If I have to close, I will close. But now that I represent the industries, I'm not saying in a way that this is something good to do, but I kind of understand because in some places, if you just do not pay, you have to close in the good scenario, because in the other hand, you may be killed or some of your workers. So I kind of understand in this what many industries are facing, and they have to go and choose to pay what we call, that we took from Colombia, what it's called vacunate, that is paying vacunas, like vaccine. And the third one, I have to finish. Okay, the third one. And the third option is to reduce or abandon operation in certain areas. And this happens a lot. So if in any of these three scenarios, making business in Ecuador is something that has totally changed. In the first thing, the human resources, the human face of the fear that we faced, of the trouble that we face in everyday working. And by the end, the costs definitely are totally changed in these last few years. If we have to include what it means to make business in a scenario where criminal organizations have control of many areas, or at least presence in most of the country. I have to close, but I have other things.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Ishmael, thank you for joining us remotely from South Africa. So South Africa is at a very different stage of a far more longstanding, far more sadly mature organized criminal sector, also one that has one of the most documented cases of state capture in the world. You are at the center of the national treasury throughout this region. So, help us, if you will, understand what this penetration of organized criminal networks into the state institutions actually looks like in practice. How did that manifest? What were the consequences for economic development, for jobs, for politics?
No, thank you, and thanks for inviting me. Yes, I think South Africa. In fact, when I was invited, I was wondering why am I invited, because I didn't see South Africa as a country in conflict in terms of traditional, in terms of any civil war or armed risings, etc. But in South Africa, I mean, I guess the important point to note is that South Africa is a very divided society. We come from a divided past. We had an apartheid government which focused on only delivering to white citizens of South Africa, who made up about, say, 10%, and the rest of us did not have the vote. So we had this great reconciliation and change. In 1994, President Mandela becomes the president. And in a sense, for the first 15 years of our democracy, there was really good economic growth. I think unemployment was being reduced significantly. Economic growth was very high. But then we had a president who really focused on capturing the state. President Zuma comes in, has a joint venture with a family called the Gupta family. They deliberately focus on the procurement system in South Africa and start looting funds. And doing so in a way, always having good political arguments of Black economic empowerment or taking business away from traditional white companies. Fast forward, we've had 15 years of miserable or no growth. Our our inequality, poverty levels have increased, and society is very divided. And the procurement system is looted. Organized crime has effectively taken over. We've got a commission currently called the Madlanga Commission, which is just looking at how many of our top cops are basically in the pockets of organized crime. And so, on the one hand, you don't see delivery by the state because it's so weakened, but two, everything that the state procures is kind of effectively looted and there's no delivery. So it does bring forth an economic and a political crisis. One, we don't grow. Two, inequality is getting worse. Three, numbers of unemployed people continue to rise as a share of adults in the economy. And I think organized crime has got so entrenched that South Africa gets grey listed by the Financial Action Task Force. So we've kind of reached a point where organized crime is really posing a threat to our democracy. You're getting a lot of division, sort of narrow groups, people mobilizing. I mean, they look at the United States and they learn how to mobilize against migrants. They take all the bad stuff from the US in that sense. And so it does raise deep questions for the state. How does the state regain its ability to deliver services? How does the state get back to ensuring economic growth? And how does the state, importantly, deal with violent crimes and deal with organized crime? Our criminal justice system is very weak at its most vulnerable. And those that commit crimes rarely kind of face any consequences. So that's a broad scenario. I think linked to that, of course, is many in organized crime, when you look at corruption, have to be linked to the political. So there's a form of either political party funding or funding specific politicians. And unless society can find a way to break that hole, I think it really does prove to be a very tough challenge, and violence does become the order of the day. We've had honest public servants who have been assassinated. We've had anybody who stands up to organized crime can easily get assassinated, killed. So yeah, let me stop there. I was just trying to paint a scenario as to what the solutions are and how we proceed. I think those are the tough challenges that we face.
Thank you. So, I mean, I think the scene setting in each of these countries is very important. Many of us are familiar with the headline cases. Sometimes that might be Chicago, sadly, or Brazil or Mexico. I think some of us need the scene set somewhat for Ecuador and South Africa, despite how well known these cases are. Eric, Papua New Guinea does not jump to the list of many people's minds when they think about organized crime and violence. And so I think scene setting here is especially valuable and important. And you come to us as the Secretary of Justice and Attorney General. And so can you scene set a little bit for us about what does organized crime and violence look like in Papua New Guinea? How has it evolved? And how has this affected the development of the country?
Thank you. So in Papua New Guinea, we don't have a lot of the impacts that we've heard from our other speakers. But what I want to share with you is about the location of Papua New Guinea. Papua New Guinea sits between the South Pacific and Asia. And the two biggest markets for illicit drugs and trade is Australia and New Zealand. Those are the two big destinations for illicit trade. And so Papua New Guinea sits in between. So we become the transit point. And that's been the major challenge for us as a country. How to protect our borders against illicit trade. And we have a very huge young population. Papua New Guinea is basically a poor country. And so we worry about our youth. the engagement of youth by organized crime. Just a few years ago, there was a huge drug transportation that was supposed to go to Australia by organized crimes in Australia. But the drugs were transported through Papua New Guinea and was going to our city, Port Moresby. And it was so heavy that the plane couldn't take off. And so the plane crashed. And we didn't know. We didn't know that the plane had landed because they had put up the radar. And so we couldn't pick up the plane. It's only after it landed that the Australian police told us that this plane had crashed in this particular spot and we needed to go and investigate. And we found the drugs and a lot of cash. And of course, in our jurisdiction, we're not used to that. And all of a sudden, we began to understand that there was a lot of things that are happening, but basically with criminal elements in Australia, using a lot of small criminal gangs in Papua New Guinea to help transit those illicit drugs. Now, just 2 weeks ago, I was in Fiji and we were having a meeting with the Pacific Police Commissioners, and we were talking about transnational crime. And we all agreed that in the South Pacific, we were being used as a transit point. And so it was really great to have the law enforcement agencies from Mexico, Colombia, coming over to the Pacific to share with us how we could be able to have a relationship so that we can work with them to see the movement of drugs coming out of South America and Latin America. We were also fortunate to have people from Europe who came to join us as well. Because for us, it's not really the use of drugs, but it's a transiting. Transiting because we're a large ocean, it's very difficult to monitor. So you can easily sneak through the ocean and take the drugs to Australia, New Zealand, and even across to Asia. Just a little experience about the involvement of politics in organized crime. A couple of years ago, I defended an accused person who was arrested for one of the biggest robberies in our city. So when he asked me to defend him, I appeared and I said, okay, bring me a file. So when I was looking through the file, he asked me, so can I succeed or not? I said, you can't succeed because there is a witness that actually saw you and recognized you. I was surprised that he told me that he could murder the witness so that he can go free. And then I said, you can't. No, but I need to go free, so I need to eliminate the witness. And I was really surprised that in Papua New Guinea, somebody can say that because it's unusual for us. And then when I asked for my fees, he said, well, there's a letter, you take it to this house and this person will pay the fee. When I arrived at this house, it was the house of a minister. And I was shocked that I was being involved in a case that involved certain groups of people. So I actually withdrew from the case the next day. So just a small example of where we're heading. And so we are very mindful of that as a Department of Justice, as a government. We are aware of what's going on, and we're taking measures to ensure that we protect our borders and our people.
Thank you so much. So, Eduardo, you of course come from Chile, which I think, like Ecuador, was surprised recently and suddenly by the severity and the change in violence and organized crime. But you now oversee a whole region. And so tell us, I think we've had some scene setting in each of these countries. Can you connect this to what this actually means for development and jobs in the region?
Thank you. I'm sure we all did, we pay attention to what Tuesday was presenting. I think that the biggest and perhaps the most important realization that we have to do when we look at organized crime in general is that it's no longer a problem related to security, but rather it clearly is a problem related to development. And in a way, it's not a way of simplifying what organized crime is, but it's a way of understanding how complex, how deep, and how wide the impact of criminal organizations are around the world. And that's perhaps what the reason why a development bank, like the Inter-American Development Bank, has made the decision to create a division fully dedicated to citizen security and justice, and why a large share of operations and a growing share of operations is going towards security and organized crime. And then I think it's also important not to base the impact that organized crime creates only on violence and only perhaps on homicides, which is clearly the indicator that we use worldwide to pretty much determine the levels of security a country has. And that indicator falls extremely short in the understanding of security really, what security really means and what organized crime is really doing. It's not only about homicides and the killings of people, but it's about the deep impact it's having in our economies, in local economies, in development as a whole, in our educational systems, in our health systems, and the livelihoods of people. So when we look at organized crime and understand that it has a deep impact in how local economies work, it also has a share in the decision-making of how those local economies are growing, or whether they're growing or not growing, who's controlling the local economies, and how fast those local economies are growing or not. And if you take that dynamic and you put it over educational system, health systems, local communities, and you take it all the way to the other extreme, which is fear, the realization of the real penetration of organized crime is much larger. So it goes all the way from shaping an economy to shaping decision-making of a woman that decides whether she's going to use public transportation or not, and at what time of the day. And it's shaping everything from, or penetrating institutions, to shaping the way a grandmother feels unsafe knowing that her grandkid is walking from school to the house, right? So it's such a broad scope of impact that looking at organized crime as a security problem, it's way, way too short from what really is. So, and if we take that, you know, how broad the impact is, and we also take it at the consequences, and we go and we look a little bit beyond murders, we look a little bit beyond direct human suffering, but we also look into how much money we're spending because of organized crime. I think the scenario opens on a very, very wide way. The cost of organized crime for Latin America and the Caribbean right now, it's 3.4 points of GDP. That's roughly 80% of what countries spend on education. Out of that 3.4% GDP, which is the average, we see countries like Jamaica where the cost is 5%, or countries like Barbados, so we remain in the same Caribbean zone, that it goes down to 2.4%. But then if we take that 3.4%, which is a lot of money, and we look at who's paying the cost of that total cost, we see that a large share, 41% of that cost, is paid by the private sector. And when I say the private sector, is much beyond commercial actors and commercial activities, households. It's how much money households are spending on buying cameras or hiring private security. And then the second share, it's paid by the public sector. That's roughly around 31%. And then there is a third category that has to do with the loss of human capital. And that is an extremely complex category because it doesn't only speak about the loss of lives, but about all the implications that organized crime have on populations, markets, and labor dynamics. It's about the impact of a kid deciding whether it's going to go to school and later join a formal market, or it's going to join a gang, or it's going to sell drugs. It's about the different paths between having fear and deciding that you cannot work at a certain time, or that you cannot use public transportation to get from point A to point B to work, or whether, as unfortunately some communities have internalized fear and they learn how to live with it. So that's how wide the impact of organized crime is today. And let me just close this intervention, and I'm sure that I'm going to get the chance to say something else later, but think about that 3.4% GDP. Think about that 3.4% GDP on a share of 10 years. And think about how that amount of money could have shaped our school systems, health systems, or whatever you want to decide to do with that amount of money for 10 years. How different could our communities look, and how different could people live if we were able to redirect that spending in a good way, of course, you know? But I mean, I think that it is extremely important and perhaps urgent that we stop looking at organized crime as a security problem and understand it as a development issue. Thank you.
Thank you. So we've done some scene setting, and this is a nice transition to what to do about it. And so I want to turn to Eric, Maria, and Ishmael about what, from their perspective, they've been able to do, or they've seen their sector, or their particular sphere that they know, what they've been able to do to disrupt criminal networks. So I'll start with Eric, and I'd like you to just talk a little bit about what was done to make security gains and also to make those durable.
So in Papua New Guinea, we have a mechanism that we bring in 15 state agencies together, and we work to monitor law and order issues in the country. So it's called the National Coordinating Mechanism. That's been in place for the last 26 years. So we're able to work with the police, with the public defender's office, the public prosecutor, with the judiciary, with the Department of Community Development. So we try to support each other in terms of national issues. So when there is an issue that emerges in the country and one of us gets to know about it, we quickly attend to the issue by talking to each of the leaders. So for example, last week, I saw something that was happening in the country, and I said, leaders, can one of you intervene? And immediately the police commissioner said, I will send my officers in to investigate and attend to the matter. And within a space of 2 days, we were able to address the issue. So that's the system that we have. Try to ensure that we protect our own networks and also to ensure that we support each other in relation to these matters. So for example, we had an Italian who actually smuggled ice into Papua New Guinea through a yacht. So we got our intelligence to pick up that there was this particular yacht coming in to what must be with the drugs. So we quickly got our police and defense organized to wait for the yacht. And when they picked up the yacht, they found a large volume of drugs, and we were able to prosecute. And it was the first time to prosecute a foreigner with a large quantity of drugs. So we worked with the police and the judiciary. So he was sentenced to 18 years imprisonment. And then I chaired a parole board. So he applied for parole. And we said, we will not give you parole because you've already been convicted and you brought in this large amount of drugs to sell to our young people, to destroy our young people. No, we will not. So he's now currently serving a prison sentence for 18 years in Papua New Guinea, a foreigner. But that's the way we work. When we pick up intelligence, we share with each other and try to see how we can be able to manage these kind of issues in PNG. So that's the network that we have. And we found that it works, and it's been in existence for 26 years.
Thank you. Maria, the private sector has been particularly active rather than a passive actor in this, which is remarkable. Could you tell us a little bit about what you've observed in attempts to push back against what's happened?
Well, honestly speaking, and I'm not pretending to depress you or anything, but I have to say that we've done a lot with very few in positive impact. And let me tell you why, because, and I can name all the list, all the initiatives that are cooperation, exchanging information, mapping some convoys, because you know that in Ecuador, we have one of our main products are agriculture products. We have shrimp, we have cacao, we have banana, and traveling from side to side to the ports. But that's something very in a short-term action. It doesn't change anything. And we build channels of communication. We have improved also taxes. Besides the taxes that we definitely have to pay, we have an extra contribution for security. But really here, what I want to share with you, one of the things that we are wondering the most, and maybe this is a philosophical discussion, is what really is the role of the private sector in terms of security? And I will go a little bit more to the side of what Javier, right? Eduardo, I'm sorry. Okay, I'm sorry. Okay, so Eduardo is I was trying to look in the text, so I was with Javier. He was saying, which for me is the key of the thing. This is a problem of development. And I'll tell you why, because if we go for a classical perspective, back to Thomas Hobbes, following up to Max Weber, the state exists because it claims the monopoly over the legitimate use of the force within the territory. Citizens and companies accept that monopoly because the state has the obligation to guarantee security, justice, and public order. In that terms of ideas, the responsibility of ruling the security belongs to the state and the institutions like the police, the armed force, the prosecutors, the judiciary, the prison system. That is something of the problems in Latin America and in Ecuador, the intelligence agencies, the local governments. That responsibility cannot be transferred to the privates. And I have to tell you that in this way of this atmosphere, sometimes of desperation that we're facing, some of these initiatives, in my personal point of view, are really close to transfer this responsibility. And I think this is a huge mistake because it's very risky to privatization of the security. And if we go that's him. Please ask him to be better behaved. If we go to extreme scenarios, we're speaking about paramilitarism. And this, we have regional experience that shows that private actors assume security functions that belong to state and that become they become immediately like actors of the violence. And this that I'm saying is definitely not popular at all, because I totally understand the role of the companies that they're seeking to survive and they are very having a bad time. And whenever they come with these initiatives, I invite them to rethink what we need. So we're doing a lot of things that I can tell you, but it's not nothing. We didn't invent anything new. We're copying what they did in Colombia, what they did in Peru. There are some actions that have better impact than others. But I think that the huge question that we from the private sector is also asking is how this formula should change in order to have development. That is what we have. And here we like to link with a speech that is very strong in the last years in Latin America, that business people, we are really evil. I mean, you know, you remember The Simpsons, Mr. Burns, he's a saint for what the political speech that is very huge in Latin America and in Ecuador is holding of what we care. You just care about money. No, when we're speaking about defending the legal jobs, we're talking about development. We're talking about people. We're speaking about how the key of these social and economic differences that we have in Latin America and a lot in Ecuador are really, how are we going to fight if now from a private sector and companies, when we're looking for people to work, for employees, we are fighting with the criminal organizations that definitely pay a lot more. And so we have a lot of distortions that there's no way that an organization as ours can face it, not even the governments. And here's where if I don't know if we will get another chance, I will claim to the international organizations that definitely they have to talk to governments. Of course, that's how it has to work. But independent of which government is ruling, we have this lack of institutions, because you know how I mentioned Thomas Hobbes and Weber, because I deeply believe in democracy. And something that we're facing is that our institutions and democratic system are not working at all. So with this huge problem that cannot be a local problem, because it's not. Ecuador will never defeat the security issues if it's not faced from an international and regional point of view. And so we'll claim for all the organizations, just like BID did it. It's not in English, BID. IDB, yeah, did it, to understand as a multi-sectoral, multi-actor problems that have to involve also many nations. Because the risk that we have is that in this lack of democracy, there comes each government with this securitization speech that is very sexy in moments when the environment, we're all scared. And they have like these short-term responses that I believe can make the problem even worse. And just to finish this part, the last idea that I want to share is that we have another variant that maybe is not considered in this discussion, that is the fear. We're not speaking about the fear. We cannot put a number to the fear and the lack of citizenship, yeah. Because right now, while I was hearing all these important messages that my colleagues are saying, I received a couple of WhatsApp that I forgot to turn off of journalists, because every day happens something in Ecuador, asking me things. And I said, I will respond afterwards, but please erase this chat. We are paranoid. Yes, we are. And it's because we feel with no north in this problem. And this, I don't know how it terms in a number, in developments, in earns, but mostly in development.
Okay, thank you. So I just want to first turn to Eduardo. I know what this role of the private sector, private security is, I know an issue very close to your heart. So I want you to speak hopefully briefly, and then we'll turn to Ishmael again about what's worked, because we've now eaten into about a quarter of our question time. And so as briefly as possible, because I would like to open up to the audience.
All right. I just find this reflection and conversation very, very interesting, because I do agree, and I think that no one could argue against the fact that the state has the responsibility to protect, right? And that's why it was created and everything. But then when we look at how much the private sector is spending, of course, the most important, perhaps the initial goal should be to lower that spending, right? Not only from the private sector, but also the public. So we can use those resources and that money on something else. But then the immediate question, and something that could happen faster, is that make that spending more efficient. And in order to make that spending more efficient, there is a huge regulatory challenge that we have ahead, certainly, but also it's about coordination. We live in a region, Latin America and the Caribbean, that has about a little bit over 4, almost 5 private security guards on the streets per every police officer. We live in a region that it's spending 47% of that 3.4 GDP on private security. So if you only take those two facts, and there are many, many more, and you turn them into something efficient and more coordinated, without even thinking about lowering it eventually, but if you turn that into your favor, the impact of private spending and private security could be quite large. And I think that that is a necessary step that we need to take when it comes to improving legislation, regulation, and capacities. And that's where perhaps one of the future lines of work lays. And it is a line of work that we've just opened this year at the Inter-American Development Bank. Because that spending is so relevant and it's so important that eventually turning private spending and private efforts to respond to something that you are talking about, right? A need. I want to open my business. I want to open it every day. I don't want to have to pay someone else an additional tax in order to operate. And I don't want to do it with fear that someone's going to come up, and steal my goods and shoot me in the head. But if we also understand that that effort could become a public good, I think that's extremely powerful. And I think that it's a very important chance that we have in our hands. Even before thinking about lowering that amount, that we have to, it's a lot. And let me tell you that I'm pretty sure that all our estimates and all our research that we've done is extremely conservative compared to the reality. And I could guarantee that those costs are much higher. But I think that's essential to understand the impact of the private sector and why private partnerships are so important when it comes to security. The problem is, and this is how I'm going to end this answer, is that if we continue to see security, organized crime as a problem related to security, we're going to continue looking at solutions on justice systems, police departments, and everything related to security. But if we see it and understand it as a development problem, we will be able to move around and coordinate more on a much easier way. That's why we as a bank has pushed for the creation of the Alliance for Security, Justice and Development. Today brings 23 countries together working for organized crime in our region. That's why we've created a task force of rapid response. I mean, two tools that are not that quite normal or that you wouldn't expect on development institutions and development banks. But we need to be there fast and we need to do it coordinated. But we also need to start thinking about this much beyond the public as a public problem, but we need to look at it as a public-private solution, not responsibility, but as a solution, a way of going into this with all the resources and capacities and development that we could have together.
Thank you. Ishmael, I believe you're still with us. We're minus 10 minutes into our question period. So I wanted to ask you about what it is, the critical institutional political factors that enabled progress. I wonder if in the brief time we have, you could highlight perhaps one that you think is perhaps the least appreciated, and then we'll jump into questions from the audience.
Thanks. Look, what we've found when we've tried to reverse the effects of state capture is to rebuild our institutions. and to get the institutions to do what they're supposed to do and to be able to act without fear or favor. I think so. I would get back to rebuilding institutions. I think that's critical. Um, when I see, for example, what's happening in the US, it reminds me of state capture in South Africa, deliberate weakening of institutions. You don't want to go there. Secondly, I think it's important for somehow to have a more agile and organized state, to look at the functioning of the system. And then more broadly, of course, it's not just dealing with the economic solutions to economic problems, but to make sure that your economy is growing, that it is more equitable, that you're getting poorer communities to benefit from such growth, that young people are getting jobs, and in a sense have hope for the future. If those things don't work, I think it's very difficult, and we have certainly not solved those problems. So it's a constant kind of dynamic that you need to work on many fronts, be able to make sure the state functions as it's supposed to function in terms of its core functions, but also to have that broader perspective and be more organized to deliver on the one hand, and yet to also be able to deal with organized crime.
Thank you. So we're going to turn to questions. Is there a mic for the audience? Is that okay? So I'll invite you to raise your hands now. A little bit of things. So many of you. Sometimes this needs to be reminded. So if you have, out of respect for the audience and the many questions, if you have multiple questions, I ask you to just choose one, and we'll try to come back if we can, which of course we won't. Apologies. I'd also like, these are questions, not statements, and so they end with a question mark. And I would ask you, once you receive the microphone, to please just give us your name and affiliation very briefly, and before your brief question.
Hi, thank you very much. And Chris, I'm a great fan of your work. I'm Christophe Predier with the United Nations, Peace and Security, specialized in SSR, security sector reform. With my colleague McCall, working on justice. So one question for Eduardo. You speak about securitization of response to criminal violence. Should we not rather speak about militarization of response to security violence? We know what happened in Ecuador a couple of years ago. And what does it mean for us? What does it mean for the UN, which has been promoting civilian governance of security, not military governance of security, not militarization of prison, civilian prisons? And what does it mean for IDB, right? And multilateral development banks? Yesterday, we organized a session with the World Bank and a lot of shareholders on security sector governance. I feel like we are going against very strong winds, right? By promoting this democratic governance. I feel our normative framework is no longer fit for purpose. Looks like in Latin America might be heading the way, breaking barriers in terms of norms. So curious to have your reaction on this, Eduardo. And of course, Maria.
Wow, those are the minutes that they send me and that I never read. I think that development institutions and specifically development banks have to choose. They can't choose everything, right? And I think that the path that we've decided to walk as a IDB right now, has at least three conditions. One, that is the path that is connected to everything we've done in development before. The second one is that we continue making justice and institution and security institutions stronger throughout the work that we've done with institutions before. And that gives you a hint regarding of who our counterparts are. We've worked a lot on police reforms and making police institutions or justice institutions stronger. But the third element has to do with the decisions that countries make and the capacities we have to partner with them to help them. And so far, until today, our work is mainly based with police institutions and justice institutions. I have no idea if things eventually change or if discussions suddenly open, but right now, trust me that we have a lot to do here still, and there's a lot of room for improvement, for working with those institutions. And I think that the impact that these institutions do have and could have, it's still much, much bigger than at the level that it is today. So that's why we remain there. And our approach is not only development, but it's mainly looking at, when we look at security, as a human security challenge. And that entails the coordination of institutions that have to do with education, health, urban development, and infrastructure. So it is widely broad, and that's where we remain, and that's where we're going. And that's what countries, our member countries, are asking us to do. And that's the way we're responding.
Thank you. Why don't we jump to another question?
Hi, my name is Camila Gonzalez. I'm in international relations and I work at ACLED. My question is about competing with the shadow benefits of illicit markets. In many places, these groups provide credit and protection that the state doesn't. How do formal job programs compete with that community safety net? Is a legal paycheck alone ever enough? Thank you.
I don't know if we just want, if just one or two of our panelists, is there anyone who wants to tackle that? Tuesday, you should also feel free to jump in. You are a panelist and not just a speaker. I mean, I can, yeah, well, I mean, I work in Medellin, Colombia, where, amongst other places, where if you're a middle manager in a drug corner at, say, age 19, you are probably in the top 20% of the city's income distribution in what is one of the wealthiest cities in the hemisphere. So that's hard. I guess the best that can be said is that drug organizations and extortion organizations can only employ so many people. In Medellin, it's 12,000 people, so it's a big sector, and in any given residential neighborhood, they're the biggest firm. There are limits, though they grow, because they invest their profits in endogenously growing demand for their products, which are addictive. And so my typical advice is that the size of that illicit labor market hinges on how big your local drug and extortion market is. And nipping that in the bud, which I think can be done. Often there are cases like Ecuador, where sometimes the authorities come a little late, but I think that's perhaps the key, because once that market is established, it's extremely difficult to eradicate.
I'll just add something. I think that just as we have to do this exercise and perhaps concrete the exercise of going from security to development, we also need to look at incentives and go much beyond money. It's about culture, it's about power, it's about protection. So when the incentives are also there, it makes it much more complex, but it's a way of understanding. Look at child recruitment. There are conventional ways of looking at that. We think that gangs and paramilitares or whatever are recruiting children, but that's not the reality. We also see individuals or small groups of people that are recruiting them through chats, right? Through social media platforms. And they're not recruiting them to make them join their gang or their group or their organizations. They're recruiting them to do specific tasks. So I think that it's extremely important to go beyond markets and understand this also as a cultural challenge that has a lot of implications, that preys on fear, that preys on a lot of vulnerabilities that people might have.
In Ecuador, for instance, we have a recent study that shows that the kids and the teenagers that just want to join these criminal organizations, they're not forced. A difference to what happened, for example, in our neighbors, Colombia, that we have this whole decade with this horrible thing that they steal kids to join the criminal organizations. In Ecuador, this something that hurt us a lot deeply in my heart is that these kids, they don't see another possibility or any future for them. Just what Eduardo said, development. So they join it. But also we have another important conversation holding in our country. As they said, the norms and the laws that we decide, that we make really bad decisions. So we have this labor regimen that is so strong and so rigid that it's very expensive to hire somebody in Ecuador, and to fire them is impossible. So right now, only 30% of the people of the working force is legal, 35%. And instead of assuming this discussion and making what kind of reforms we need, because young people don't want to work forever, they want to work sometimes from home, etc., etc. No, we have these political groups that are the ones that represents the workers mostly. I just come last week from Geneva, where we representing the ILO, the conference, and we're still having, and this is a hard thing that I'm going to say, from Europe, we have a lot of countries that what the institutions do not let them do, okay, they can do it back home in Latin America. So they're with all these NGOs that they're fighting for the dignity of the workers, etc., etc. And we're not facing the reality. So in Ecuador, it's very easy to join the criminal organizations and very hard to get formal work, legal work.
Great. Do we have another question?
Thank you. My name is Dara Esquivel. I'm a senior financial sector specialist here at the World Bank. I'm here with my colleague, Michelle. We both work in a small unit at the bank that works on financial integrity, aka anti-money laundering. And I guess my question is mostly directed to Ismael and Eric, because the good news that I come with good news. The good news that I bring is that the anti-money laundering toolbox is very useful in disrupting international organized crime. And it's a toolbox that we're very much ready to use. And we see how countries are implementing it successfully. And the challenge that we see now as the World Bank is disrupting these corridors of illicit financial flows that are the big thing. Eric, you talked about this whole of government approach to the drug trafficking. And Ismael, we know, because we've worked very closely with South Africa as well, with the STAR initiative, how you're implementing also a whole of government approach through fusion centers and through bringing in different agencies to work together. So my question to the two of you is, how are you implementing financial integrity and anti-money laundering into your strategy to disrupt large criminal organizations? Thank you.
Why don't we start with Ismael and then we'll move to Eric. Ismael, please go ahead.
Yes, no, thanks. Look, I think South Africa having got grey-listed in a sense was a blessing in disguise, because we had been weakened after state capture. But it also sensitized the country, I think, to the importance of putting mechanisms to fight money laundering and, in a sense, corruption. And I think some of the tools that we've used, the national risk assessments, forcing various authorities to work together to share information, breaking those silos, I think has been incredibly useful. So I would say that there are lessons to be learned. Obviously, it's still work in progress, and we still need to continue to strengthen and improve. But I think those mechanisms have proved to be very useful.
Yeah, so you will note that Papua New Guinea got grey-listed in February this year. And so one of the key elements of our conditions is we need to improve our processes on anti-money laundering. So I chair the National Committee on Anti-Money Laundering. So we would be really happy to take the toolbox. Please give it to us so we can use it. But as a system, we've got 25 agencies that meet monthly to try and work together to ensure that we improve our systems and processes. In the anti-money laundering space, we've also tried to strengthen the work of the Independent Commission Against Corruption. So the whole idea is to try and break the the corruption that gives birth to money laundering. We're also working with the police to ensure that we strengthen prosecution, because our FIU does give us a list of suspicious transactions. And I think Ismail has gone through it already. So we are just on a journey, and we'll be looking to the World Bank as well to help us to strengthen our processes to overcome this particular problem in PNG. Thank you.
Great. So it sounds like we do want a few minutes for a little bit of wrap up, but I think we have time for at least potentially one more question.
Hello, everyone. My name is Jacqueline Stein. I'm with Free a Girl USA. We rescue children from sexual exploitation worldwide. And what was just said about children being recruited to chats and social media, it's exactly what we see. And sexual exploitation is one of the fastest growing criminal markets and is largely invisible in this conversation. So my question is, as you design and develop solutions, where the children and who is founding these organizations that are already working on the ground?
I don't know, was it for me? No? Yeah, well, I'll answer anyway. But yeah, I mean, this is a growing concern that we have as a bank. Norma is here with us, and we actually just started a new initiative working with the OSCE, which is the European friends, because this is a shared problem that we're not only seeing with similar characteristics in Latin America, but also in Eastern Europe and Europe. State capacities for this are different. I mean, they vary a lot country to country. Our work so far has to do with building that capacity within the countries, within the government. So we haven't reached out that much to like non-profit or the non-governmental organization sector that far, because we still believe that there is a lot of capacity to build within institutions. And just as I said, regarding development and many other things, that we need to stop thinking about physical borders and how we control everything that happens in our territory when the boundaries are not made, and when the boundaries are non-existent. And I think, just as we've talked about the private actors and the private sector, I think that we still have a lot to do with the private sectors. There are apps today. I mean, the phones are probably the most dangerous tools for recruitment right now, right? But there are apps right now that because they work on certain levels of privacy, that they make it really hard for prosecutors and investigators to get the information they need in order to investigate and pursue someone. So I think that the opportunity does not only lay on institutional capacity or supporting different actors that are working on the ground, but also on mobilizing the private sector and understand this as a common shared problem that has a common and shared solution. And this is something that we're developing as a bank, and it's an area of work that we see a lot of need all over the region, but a lot of points in common with other countries around the world. It's a global phenomena that it's behaving very similar all across the globe, rather with a regional or a country identity.
Okay, so we're basically at closing time, and I was just asked to put together some, closing remarks, pull such a huge and amorphous and challenging topic together. I just want to highlight a few things that jumped out at me across some of the things our speakers said. I think first, I think if you are in Nairobi or Lagos or Mumbai, or I could list any other long list of capitals without a serious apparent organized crime problem, I would pay attention to Papua New Guinea and Ecuador and Chile, and the extent to which this snuck up quickly and snuck up fast. Not to be indelicate, but this problem is a little bit like herpes. Once you've got it, it's very difficult to get rid of it. And I think it is the nature of government to not perhaps respond preventatively, but rather to react. And in this case, it's never quite too late, but it's particularly important. And so I think one of the interesting things we've seen here is just how quickly this snuck up. I think another theme that I'm quite struck by is one of Eduardo's colleagues who I was with in Brazil last week, and when I was in Rio, where we had more time, I could tell you some of the things that even after 25 years, I was astonished by. But what he asked me is, he says, what do we do? Our chief problem is, what do we do in a world where the response is increasingly populist and authoritarian, the mano dura, the crackdown approach. And I will be the first to defend that there are times and places, frequent times and places for crackdown approaches. But it is not the only tool in the toolkit, and it's not the most appropriate. And I think what each of our speakers outlined was either private sector or criminal justice system approaches that were able to make progress. At the same time, as I mentioned at the beginning, the toolkit is not particularly rich and deep, and nor are our early efforts always successful. And they never are. Even with simple problems, our first attempts seldom succeed. And with a problem as complicated and wickedly hard and difficult and varied as this problem, our early successes are going to be few and far between, but we're going to need to iterate and try again. I do think that this is the security and development challenge of the next 30 years. 20 years ago, 25 years ago, I'm old enough to remember when the World Bank was a leader in recognizing that fragility and conflict and violence was essentially, had been the chief problem of the late 20th century for development, and was going to continue to be the chief problem for development. And so they caught up somewhat late, but they led. They led in operations and they led intellectually, to the point that after 20 years of fragility forums, people are actually like, another fragility forum? Like, we're almost, that's success. We're exhausted with the degree to which the World Bank and other large development actors are focused on conflict and fragility. And I think what we're not seeing we're not seeing that in organized crime. The World Bank is arguably, I would say, the most important, the most effective, often the intellectual leader, and has succeeded. It's somehow found itself, and friends speak truth to friends. I think it's found itself perhaps outside of some of the money laundering work, where I agree there has been considerable progress. The World Bank is the least relevant development actor in the planet when it comes to this issue. It was once one of the least relevant development actors when it came to conflict, and it quickly became the leader. And so I'm deeply hopeful that this will change, because these actors are smart, they are well funded, they move fast, they experiment, they are crafty, they are harder adversaries than the conflict actors the bank and these governments have been dealing with in fragile states for the last 20 or 30 years, 40 or 50 years. And so the job is more difficult. And so all hands on deck. Thank you very much. Please help me in thanking our panel.